Hi there, and welcome to part 3A of my GIS for Geography Teachers video series. So in this part we're going to start getting practical and look at some basic crime mapping using the open source QGIS GIS software. So QGIS, as I've mentioned in previous sessions, is completely free and open source and is available to download from www.qgis.org. And if you go there, hit download now, and I'd recommend initially downloading the standalone installer, and most computers these days are 64-bit. There are Mac, Linux, and even mobile versions. I'm working on Windows myself, and if you're not familiar with QGIS, I would recommend probably watching one of my overview QGIS videos first, because that will just give you a walkthrough of all the essentials in a bit more detail. But if you don't want to do that, I will go through all this step by step. So download the software, open it up, and you'll end up with a screen that looks very much like the one in front of me now, and you can pick it up from there. So the first thing that I'm going to do is actually add in a base map. So when you first install QGIS, it should, on the left hand side here under the XYZ tiles option, you may need to click the down arrow to show it, have this OpenStreetMap base map option. So we can just drag and drop that and we'll immediately have a world base map. So this is streaming from the web, so you will need to have an internet connection for this to work. OpenStreetMap's a really interesting project in its own right if you're not familiar with it, and a good one to mention to students in terms of sort of examples of GIS and mapping projects. It's basically a user-generated world map. So imagine kind of Google Maps, but generated with contributions from volunteers around the world. And it's actually used a lot in humanitarian and disaster situations to provide base mapping. So a good example is the Haiti earthquake a few years ago, where the area was very poorly mapped. Satellite companies released very high resolution satellite data of the area, and users were able to go in using OpenStreetMap and map roads, buildings, bridges, internally displaced people's camps, areas that had been destroyed based on the high resolution satellite imagery, and aid agencies were then able to use the OpenStreetMap data in order to plan their response, identify where people were in need, and that kind of thing. So it's worth a Google in its own right if it's not something you're familiar with. But as far as we're concerned, it provides a great base map that we can use for all kinds of different projects. And I'm just going to zoom in on the UK because that's where I'm going to be working. So the next thing we're going to need is some crime data. Now, what I'd probably recommend doing if you're going to run this as a practical is downloading the crime data in advance and kind of providing it to your students already downloaded. Although obviously if they're working at home, then they might be able to download it themselves, and that might be just as easy. So the place that I'm going to go to for this is data.police.uk/data. And this is basically the UK kind of police website that provides crime data. Exactly when they publish it varies by force, so I'd probably recommend going back a few months because not every force will have the latest data available. And you can choose to download data for individual months, time periods, so from one month to another, and you can pick which force you want to use. So just for ease, I'm going to download January 2020, so just 1 month, so it's not too much data to work with. And I'm going to use Cheshire Constabulary just because that's local to me and where I work. And once you've selected your dates and force, you can just click generate file. Just a quick note here, so by default it downloads crime data, so that's kind of where the incident was, when it was reported, what type of incident it was, and it does have some notes on kind of follow-up and outcomes. You can download separate outcomes data and stop and search data, which come as separate files, but I'm not going to recommend doing that for now. Let's keep it simple and just download the single crime data file. So then we just need to click generate file, And for a short time period, it should just take a few seconds. If you're selecting several forces or going back years, it will take a bit longer to generate. And then just click download now. And what we'll get is a zip file, which most computers should be able to open by default. And there'll be a folder inside it, and then a CSV file. So that's just a kind of standard file type that we could open in Excel. So what I recommend doing is right click, copy that file, go to wherever you're going to be working. So I'm going to be working in my data and GeoTeach folder. I've already downloaded some bits, and paste that file in there. So 2020-01 for January, Cheshire Street. So that's the data that I'm going to be working with. And we can just open this in Excel, so it's worth just having a double click. If you've got Excel or a similar piece of software installed, it will open up and we can see what's contained. So we have a unique crime ID, the month, which obviously is all January 2020, who it was reported by, which constabulary it's in. Importantly, we have longitude and latitude coordinates, which are going to allow us to easily map this data in GIS, a descriptive location, authority codes, the type of crime, and the outcomes. So if you want to do any manipulation, then at this stage you could do, say you want to kind of spare your students the nitty-gritty, we could kind of sort by crime type, remove violent and sexual offences, for example, so that they don't have to know where they've happened within the area. So if you're more familiar with Excel, it can be quite easy to filter things out at that point. And if you want to, we could narrow down the number of columns to make it less confusing. We're not going to use the crime ID, for example, so we could just delete that column entirely so that it's not going to be there to confuse the students when they're looking at the data. And then simply save it and make sure you close it down before you attempt to open it within QGIS. So now we've got our data, we can go back to QGIS. And the best way to add CSV files in is actually using this data source manager. You can drag and drop them, it can lead to a few problems. So for adding the CSV, we're going to click on this data source manager up here and click on the browse button here to find our file. So it's always important, and it's something to emphasize to students, to know where you save your files. You know, something that I've discovered in recent years is that a lot of students are used to working with tablets and phones and things syncing to the cloud and not really thinking about where they save their data. So actually having them understand, okay, your computer may have different drives, or even your mobile device if that's what you use, because we can install QGIS on Android and iPhone, although it's not really optimized for it, so it's a little bit more awkward. But we need to know where our data is. So in my case, it's C data GeoTeach, and then I'm going to open this 2020-01 Cheshire Street. And what we can see is it's picked up, it's a CSV file, and under geometry definition, it's picked up that it's points, and it's automatically picked up that our X field is longitude and our Y field is latitude. So we can see it's using coordinates in degrees down here. And all we need to do now is leave those settings as they are and simply click Add. And if I close this down, we can now see that we've got a point layer that's appeared on our map. And we can start to zoom in and see what that's showing us. So I've downloaded data for Cheshire. We can turn things on and off by ticking and unticking in the layers box here. So if I untick that, it will disappear and we can see what's underneath. If I tick it, the points come on. So we can kind of see we've got Warrington up towards the top here, Runcorn, Chester, Crewe, and a few other kind of towns. And we can very much see straight away how, you know, the crimes are tending to cluster towards the urban areas, although we do have a scattering of crimes in between. Now, Cheshire is not the most crime-ridden county, thankfully, so we don't have a ridiculous amount of data for this period. If we downloaded it for, say, Manchester or central London, we'd probably have a lot more points to deal with. So we can get a general picture of the data just looking at it here, and it's worth at this early stage exploring, and we can see all of the data that we saw in Excel by simply right-clicking on the layer in our layers window here and going to Open Attribute Table. And here we go. We can now see all of the data that we looked at within Excel. Obviously the ID field is missing because we deleted that. And probably most importantly, we can see this list of crime types. And if we wanted to, we could click on crime type at the top there to sort it by alphabetical order and skim through to kind of look at some of the different options that we have available. So that just quickly introduces the idea of attributes table. And if we make sure we've got this layer selected in the layers window, we can also click on this identify tool up here, zoom in on a feature and give it a click, and we can then see the data for that individual feature. So we can see that this one here did come under violence and sexual offences. It doesn't give any details, so it could have been a punch up in the street, and they were unable to prosecute the suspect. So it just kind of indicates how our attribute table links to each of these individual features. What we'll do next is clear the results so that it's unselected and just close this down. And although it's a little bit morbid perhaps, I've found that the fact that we have crime data across the UK, we can download it for our local area. Students do get quite intrigued to see what's been going on down their street or around the corner. Has there been much crime? What kind of things have happened? So viewing the dots is fine, and we can start to see where they cluster, but it might be better if we could view these as hotspots. So luckily we can do that quite easily in QGIS if we right click on the layer and go to Properties. Now there's a lot of different options in Properties and we don't need to worry about most of them, so the one that we want is called Symbology. So Symbology is basically how we display our different features, how we symbolize them on the map. And at the moment it's set to single symbol, so all of our features are displayed exactly the same way as a little purple circle. If we drop that down, we can see we have various options, and the one that I'm going to jump straight to is heat map at the bottom here. And actually we can just change to heat map and then click apply to see what happens. And we can straight away see that we've now got a series of smudges basically on the map that indicate where more crimes happen, to put it bluntly. Now that's not very helpful because we've now hidden our map underneath and can't see what's going on, but we can play around with a few settings to make it look a bit nicer. So the first thing I'd recommend doing is clicking this little bit that says layer rendering tucked away at the bottom here. That basically means how it draws the layer. And the top thing we have here is opacity, so that's whether it's opaque, we can't see through it, and the lower we make that number, the more it will go towards transparent, we can see through it. So I'm going to set mine to about 60% opaque, so 40% see-through, and click apply. And suddenly we can see that we now have the map underneath visible, so we can start to see which areas we're looking at. The other thing to probably change is the colour ramp. So black and white isn't the greatest thing for displaying heat maps really, so I'm going to change it to the magma option and click apply. And to me that stands out much more effectively. We now have these nice bright areas where our heat maps are, so where there's been greater clustering of crimes, and dark areas where there's been less criminal activity, fewer reported crimes within the area. If we want to, we can play with some of the other settings, so in particular the radius option here. So at the moment this is set to millimeters, so this is going to create the heat maps based on whatever's on our screen at the moment in time. If we zoom in and out and move around, then we'll start to see those change. And actually I'll just demonstrate that quickly. So if I zoom out, then we can see it actually starts to clump the data together into more generalized hotspots. If I were to zoom in on Warrington, we'll see it break down and show more detail with regards to what's going on in the area. So if I go back to that properties, if I were to increase the radius to say 25 millimeters, then we can see that generalizes it even more. If I were to reduce it to 5 millimeters, then it breaks down almost to individual crime points in a lot of cases. So it's quite interesting to play with that number, because actually that has a big influence on what we actually see. So I'm going to set it back to 10 for now. And the other thing that's really interesting to investigate, so we could spend some time just kind of zooming in and out, moving around the map, looking at how that causes things to vary, and where the general hotspots are and where the more localized sort of areas of crime are. But the next thing to look at is back in Properties, and this time we're going to change from the Symbology tab to the Source tab. And there's various bits of information here. It tells us what our layer is called, it tells us what coordinate system it's in, and I might say a little bit about coordinates in a minute as a kind of extension activity, if you like. But what we want for now is actually this Query Builder button down the bottom. Now, what the Query Builder allows us to do is use those attributes that we looked at earlier, and in particular the crime type, to actually look at just particular types of crime. So at the moment we're seeing hotspots for all crimes, but actually are they occurring in different locations depending on the type of crime? And what we can do here is just create a query by clicking on the bits we want. So we can double click on crime type, and that goes into our query down the bottom here. So we want our crime type to equal, so click the equal sign, and then if we single click on crime type, over here we can click on all, and it will list all of the different options we have for crime type. So let's go with burglary. Okay, so crime type equals burglary. Okay, and hopefully you saw in the background that there was a sudden jump there. So now, rather than showing us where all crimes occur, it's just showing us where burglaries have occurred. And did I manage to undo that? Yeah, I managed to not click apply. So go back through again. Crime type equals all burglary. Okay, and don't click cancel like I did, click OK. There we go. So we're now looking at the areas in which burglaries have occurred. And we can zoom out, look in different areas. So move over to Warrington, for example. And what we can see is actually there's not many burglaries happening around the centre. Unsurprisingly, burglaries happen more in kind of the more residential areas where there's more houses and potentially more opportunities for burglaries to take place. If we were to go back in and change that, so back to Query Builder, click Clear to remove that, and this time crime type equals list all, and let's go shoplifting, and then OK. And now we can see a very different pattern. So now our shoplifting offences are very much clustered, we click OK, towards the city centre. Again, unsurprisingly, this is where the shops are, and we can probably see a few more localised shopping centres where odd incidences of shoplifting have taken place. And the same goes with other towns. If we go to Chester, we can see that shoplifting is actually clustered around the city centre again, the retail park, and Hall, which is a kind of suburb that has its own mini shopping area. So they're our main areas for shoplifting within Chester. So we can actually use this and use these attributes to start to investigate how the patterns vary depending on the type of crime that we're looking at. And that probably, the key things to look at for an initial exercise. So we've got quite a bit there really. We've introduced the idea of geographical data with coordinates to be able to add it into our map. We've got latitude and longitude that allow us to plot these points. We can visually look at where these points are. We can have attributes behind them, so we can start to see the fact that each point has a whole series of information behind it. And if we wanted to now, we could actually go back to our symbology, change our style back to single symbol, and we can start to see the individual points that make up that, or those shoplifting hotspots. And again, we could use the identify tool to click on one of those. So this was on or near shopping area, it was shoplifting, and again they were unable to prosecute the suspect. If we find another one, there we go. So this one obviously was prosecuted and they're awaiting court outcome. So we can see all of that information that lies behind these points. Now, one thing that might be an interesting extension exercise and is also useful just to know about in general is to go back into our properties, change it back to heat map once again, click apply. I'm going to change it back to magma again. So let's look at these values we were using again. So we played around with them earlier, how it varied as we changed the values. Now actually on the right hand side here we have different options. So by default it's set to millimeters. We can change it to points, which is the same as font size points. We have pixels, but we also have map units. So this allows us to use, rather than millimeters based on your screen, which obviously changes as you zoom in and out and move around, map units allows you to calculate them based on actual measurements on the map, so within however much of an area. So if I leave that at 10 and hit apply, it suddenly goes very small. Now, one of the things we have at the moment is we need to know what coordinate system we're working in. And actually we're in pseudo Mercator at the moment. So when we say 10 in here, it's important that we know what our map units actually are. So looking at the size, it looks as though it has interpreted these as possibly meters. So if we'd had it in proper latitude longitude coordinates, which I thought it may have been, but I think because we added the OpenStreetMap layer in first, it's gone to pseudo Mercator. Let's try 4326. So coordinate systems are something you kind of get to grips with over time. They each have a numeric code which makes it easy to find if you know what that code is. They also have names as well. So I'm going to actually change it to 4326, which is WGS, World Geodetic System 1984. And that's basically latitude longitude coordinates. So that's our original coordinates. We can see that the map has actually distorted slightly, and our hotspots have basically disappeared, and that's because we're now trying to do hotspots that are 10 degrees in size. And obviously 10 degrees is a huge distance. Exactly how much 10 degrees is varies depending on where we are in the world. So we could try and get something more meaningful if we change this to say 0.001. Let's give that a go. There we go. So if we go to 0.001 degrees, then actually that's small enough to start to generate hotspots again. But working in degrees isn't ideal. I don't know about you, but I find it very hard to visualize in my head how many degrees it is from one end of Chester to the other when it's tiny fractions. So this is where changing coordinate systems becomes very useful. So if we click down in the bottom corner here again where it sets, so CRS stands for Coordinate Reference System. So if we want to change the coordinate reference system for our map, and I'm going to change it just to type in here British, and it's already come up with the only option, or actually it's come up with several options, recently used. So let me keep on typing, and it helps if I can spell, British National Grid. And it's actually come up with a couple of options. The one that we should use is this one here, the top one, with EPSG code 27700. So British National Grid is basically the coordinate system that Ordnance Survey maps use. So it means if we set our map to this, And when I click OK, you should see the shape change slightly in the background as it reprojects it. Gave me a little warning. You can just click OK on that, so I'm not going to worry about that. But you can see how the shape has changed slightly. And we can see the coordinates down the bottom corner here, on our map. So actually these are now the same coordinates that you would be able to read off of an Ordnance Survey map. So this also means that if we went out with an Ordnance Survey map and collected data, we could find these coordinates and use it to plot our points onto a map in the real world. But one of the good things about British National Grid is we know that British National Grid is measured in metres. So if I come back here now, so what's a sensible radius to look at hotspots? Let's say 500 metres. So it's going to look at within kind of a 500 metre radius to identify clusters of crime points. And there we go. And what we now see is as we zoom in and out, it's not changing so much because it's using that set 500 metres map units rather than changing to fit our screen. And actually that's quite broad, so let's reduce it slightly. Let's try 250 metres. And we can see we start to get a little bit more detail. And the smaller that number, the more detailed it's going to be. So let's bring it back to 250. And again, we can kind of zoom out and look around the map. And what we'll see is it may change the colours depending on what the maximum is on the screen, but the actual hotspot areas will stay the same, and we can zoom into different areas and start to see where these hotspots are. And remember, at the moment, we still have it set to just show shoplifting, so I could go back here, click clear, OK, and now it's gone back to showing the hotspots for all of the different crime types, so we now have much more going on. So there we go, that's a quick introduction to crime mapping. There are other directions we can take it in. We could use the symbology and go to categorized, and in our value, so this allows us to basically colour different points according to a field. So we could actually say crime type, for example. If we click classify, it's now listed all the different crime types and plotted a different colour for each crime type, so we can start to get an idea of perhaps which crimes happen more often. Another interesting one might be to do the outcome category. So we want to delete the existing classes, yes, and then we can start to see how many have been sort of resolved, whether they've been given a caution, drugs possession warnings, penalty notices, so all of the different outcomes that come from different crime types. So actually, if we wanted to, there are many different questions that we could start to ask, many different things that we could investigate just using this one quite simple data set. So lots of things to explore right there, and like I said, there's the potential to tie it into at least relatively local areas. You may not want to focus on your precise neighbourhood, but maybe the nearest large town or city centre, and focus in on that area. So I hope that was interesting. I hope that's given you kind of an idea for an exercise that you could carry out with students, and also given you an introduction to some of the functionalities of QGIS. And what I hope you've picked up is that it is quite straightforward and quite easy to do some of this analysis. We can very quickly and easily add these crime points in, visualize them, create hotspots, and start to look at how it differs between different types of crime. So in part 3b, I'll try and do a similar exercise, but using ArcGIS Online, so removing the need to download QGIS. It will be slightly simplified, but actually a lot of these functions are achievable in ArcGIS Online as well as they are in QGIS. So hopefully I'll see you next time, and please do remember to like and subscribe if you found that useful, because it just helps support me and get the videos out there, and hope to see you again. Thanks.